Hello and welcome everyone to OnPoint Technologies PCM and MacMall webinars Wednesday. We are thrilled to have you with us for Microsoft Azure webinar, which is on controlling clouds in the cloud, controlling costs in the cloud. And to present on this topic, we have got John Pontius, who is Azure Solutions Sales Professional. But before going into our main presentation, we have got a few housekeeping items. Please remember to enter your questions in the question box on your right-hand side, and I'll read those over to our speaker this morning at the end of the presentation. We do send out a survey, which you'll find in your inboxes later today. Please fill it out and let us know how we did, as well as topic you'd like to see covered. Speaking of future webinars, please be sure to check out weekly webinar schedule on our website, www.onpoint.com/webinars, and also on www.pcm.com/webinars. We are also recording this webinar, which will be available for playback in the next few days. Recordings are posted to our webinar pages, which will be on www.onpoint.com/webinars and also on www.pcm.com/webinars. And with that, we'll go ahead into our main presentation today. I'm happy to hand it off to our main speaker, John Pontius, who is Azure Solutions Sales Professional.
All right. So thanks very much, everyone, for attending. My name is John Pontius. I'm an Azure Solutions Sales Professional with PCM. And today we're going to talk about controlling costs in the cloud. The agenda for this webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about what Azure is. I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but it's useful to have some background on how the model for IT procurement and purchasing has changed. We're going to talk about understanding the Azure consumption model, how things are billed, how that bill presents to you, the end user, when you start moving workloads and start using services into the cloud. I'm going to talk a little bit about estimating Azure expenses, the Azure hierarchies and reporting tools that are available to you, a new service that Microsoft is making available called Azure Advisor that can help control costs in the cloud, and then the Azure hybrid use benefit and compute pre-purchase plans that can really start taking advantage of investments that you have already made in your software and looking at steady state and predictable workloads that can also result in massive savings, especially when you're talking about what we call infrastructure as a service or IaaS. So what is Azure? Azure is Microsoft's cloud platform made up of technologies and services that empower business to take advantage of cloud computing by provisioning and scaling the necessary resources on demand and pay-as-you-go. So the last two pieces of that are very important when we're talking about controlling costs in the cloud. So the traditional model of IT procurement was that a project got greenlit and then the necessary resources for that project were requested. Those resources were either provisioned in the instance of like an on-premise data center, or they were purchased through IT procurement. Once those resources were provisioned, we had the ability to go in and monitor, start getting the project set up, start installing the correct software. And we're talking about a much, an elongated timeline depending on workflows and that process, anywhere from a week to a month from when a project was greenlit to when the actual resources were available to start. Cloud computing changes all of that. I can get a server stood up in Azure in a matter of minutes. I can get multiple different sizes of servers. I can get Azure SQL databases. I can get Linux servers. I can do this all on demand. So we've shrunk the amount of time it takes from wanting to attempt a project, from wanting to try out a workload, to when we can actually get the resources necessary to begin that task. In Azure, I am only ever paying for the compute resources or services that I use. So we'll obviously talk a little bit here about how that consumption model works. But what this means is that my spend is much more closely aligned to the actual resources that are required for a particular task or to deliver a particular application than was ever possible before. And what that means is that cloud computing in Azure is a very powerful model for IT departments that are looking to do more with less. Very powerful model to get out of over-provisioning or elongated provisioning and procurement periods to get projects started. We can now use the resources and the scalability and elasticity of the cloud to dramatically lower costs, especially when we talk about things like development and testing, and massively reduce the amount of time it takes to get projects and applications and workloads off the ground. But what this means is that we've transformed our IT spend from a majority CapEx model, where we were making large upfront investments in our workloads and in our data centers. So we've turned a majority CapEx model, large upfront investments, into a majority OpEx model, where we are aligning our resources and our spend with what is necessary to deliver projects and business value. And that means that controlling costs and being able to measure those costs and examine those costs are more important than ever. Once you get out of the mindset of having these large upfront capital expenditures that are going to represent the majority of your IT spend, and instead you are going to have to monitor a bill every single month, quarter, or year, depending on the way you choose to purchase, that encompasses the entirety of your virtual machines, your storage, your networking, and your bandwidth costs. It becomes very important to be able to get an idea of not only what you are using currently, where that usage is coming from, but also being able to create the correct reporting structures and hierarchy that make it possible to do things like chargebacks and have predictive power over what the next workload and the next workload is going to cost. And this presentation is really talking about how the Azure model and the cloud model can enable you to get that granularity and reporting in detail. The first thing that we're going to talk about is how you get visibility into where that spend is coming from, as opposed to, I know that it's costing me money, but I don't exactly know where that cost is coming from. And then moving into ways that we can utilize some of the native things in Azure Services in Azure to get a handle on, okay, what can we be doing better? Where can we find cost savings on what our steady state, predictable, or even bursted workloads are? So we'll talk a little bit about understanding Azure consumption. For anybody that is currently using Azure, I'm sure that this is familiar to you. For people that are looking at Azure, that are thinking about ways that the cloud can provide value to them, this will be important to understand what that costing model looks like and how you start consuming resources. So this is a full, not a full, but a pretty comprehensive list of all of the services that are available in Azure right now. We can see that we have platform services indicated by things like Azure Apps, SQL Database and Data Warehouse. We have things like Analytics and IoT. And then we have more basic infrastructure services. These are things like virtual machine storage and networking. When you start to consume Azure, when you get access to the Azure portal, when you set up an Azure billing account, whether that is PayAsYouGo, Enterprise Agreement, CSP, you have access to all of these services up front. In Azure, there is no, oh, I need to pay for X amount of storage, or I need to pay for this virtual machine size. You do get charged for that, but when you go in and you start using the service, that's not the way that the cost presents. You have access to all of these services right away within the Azure portal, and we'll talk about that. Every service in Azure has a meter and a rate. So the meter, it determines, okay, how much am I getting charged per minute for virtual machines, per gig for storage, per database for things like Azure SQL Database. All of those, that is the meter for those services, and then they will all have a rate. So virtual machine sizes will have different rates per minute based on the size of the machine. Storage of different types, whether it is block blob or disk blob or page blob, whether it is locally redundant or geo-redundant, will have its own cost per gig. And then things like Azure SQL Database, based on the database size and tier, will have its own separate rate. All of the Azure services that we saw on the last slide will have their own separate meter and rate. And when you start to consume services, it's important to understand what that meter and rate is, how it's being measured, and what you're getting charged. So billing is done against those services rates. So if you are what we call pay-as-you-go or cloud service provider customers, you are getting something like a monthly bill in arrears. So you will see a measure of all of the meters that you have consumed, the rates against those. That's what's going to make up your Azure invoice at the end of the month when Microsoft charges you. If you are an enterprise customer with an enterprise agreement or a server cloud enrollment, you've made an upfront monetary commitment to Azure, which is basically a prepaid credit card for Azure services. And that big bucket of money that you have created on your agreement, you will deduct from that bucket of money based on the meter and rate of services that you actually use. Billing is prorated for actual use of services. So you are only ever, like we talked about on the first slide, you're only ever responsible for paying for the services that you have actually consumed. Whether that is 10 hours of virtual machine time, 744 hours, which is a month of virtual machine time, whether that's a terabyte of data or 500 gigs of data, or variable dynamic data that has changed throughout the course of the month, you are only ever getting charged for what you actually use. And this encourages you to start thinking differently about what IT spend looks like in Azure. The idea of a static virtual machine or static disks that are attached, it still makes a lot of sense to us intuitively because it's how we deploy and how we've deployed things in the past, but it's not where you're going to find the most value or lower your cost the most when you start moving to the cloud. So you need to think about, okay, what workloads are actually being used 744 hours a month? What workloads need 24/7 uptime? Are there workloads that I can shut down on Friday at 5 and spin back up Monday at 7 a.m.? And we can do that through things like Azure Automation, where we can actually automate shutdown and startup processes so that you're not getting charged compute rates for the times that those machines are deallocated. We can start thinking about, predictably bursted workloads that need maybe 8 or 9 instances or larger amounts of compute power towards the end of the month as we close out accounting and things. But for the rest of the time can be scaled back to meet the actual demands of the service for the other 3 weeks. These are the ways that you need to start thinking when you're deploying applications in Azure, because these are the ways that you can really find a lot of cost savings versus the traditional model of, I have a thing, it is in a data center, it consumes these resources, and it does 24/7 all month. Part of making these choices and thinking differently about how we're deploying resources is being able to get a predictable model of what a workload is going to cost in the cloud and what migrating a workload or application is going to consume at that for Azure resources. So we're going to talk a little bit here about estimating Azure usage. So the easiest tool, and one that's available to every single person on this call, is called the Azure Calculator. It's available on azure.com. It's simple to use. You add services, you identify what services you want, how often those services are going to be in use, where those services will live, and Azure and Microsoft will create a report for you that you can then examine, export, save as an Excel file for predicting what the next workload and the subsequent workload after that is going to cost. Almost all Azure services are available in this calculator. There are a few services that are not available. The other thing that you will find that's not available on this calculator is subscription services within Azure that consume at a different rate, so things like Azure Active Directory Premium, which is a per-user subscription. But almost all of the consumption-based model services for Azure as well as their respective locations and locales are available in the Azure pricing calculator. Some things to remember here is that when you're configuring products, make sure you are configuring for the correct type and location. So some of the things that you'll want to think about are, where does this workload make the most sense? If I am a California-based company, I'm probably looking at the West data center for low latency. However, I may be trying to serve customers with this application or workload that are located in Europe. And in that case, we may want to look at West Europe or North Europe for those workloads. Pricing can vary from region to region. So you want to make sure that when you're estimating your prices, you're looking at the correct region for where you want to situate those workloads. Make sure you're selecting the correct instance size, and make sure you're selecting, and obviously that's going to be a little bit variable when you're doing estimating. There's a lot of different machine sizes in Azure. There's a lot of documentation. I would recommend, if you have a question about that, that you reach out to your PCM account executive, and we can help you kind of determine what the best size machine is going to be for that. Make sure you're selecting the correct instance size. Make sure you're selecting the correct licensing. We'll talk towards the end here about some of the ways that you can save money by taking advantage of some of the investments you've made currently with your licensing. But if you need SQL Server, if you need SQL Server Enterprise, if you need BizTalk Server, if these are things that are required for the application that you're not going to bring your own licenses for, make sure that when you're estimating out usage, you include that, because those can make material differences on the cost. Within Azure, because it's a pay-as-you-go model, there are lots of costs that are associated with running a virtual machine that maybe are not immediately obvious when we think about the ways that we've deployed things on-premise. So don't forget that you will need to add storage to virtual machines to make sure that you have disks available for persistent data. There is a OS disk attached to every virtual machine. You should not put production data on that, because the way that Azure updates work, eventually you will lose that data. However, disks attached to Azure will have locally redundant or geo-redundant capabilities to make sure that they're fault tolerant and will not be lost, and that data will not be lost. Bandwidth cost. Within Azure, within most public clouds, ingress data, so sending something up to the cloud, is always free. Egress data is going to be charged on a per gig basis. So if you're using something, if you're either accessing this application through the web, or you're using something like a site-to-site VPN tunnel, don't forget to include an estimate of your bandwidth costs when you think about the overall cost of the solution as you predict this out. Like we were talking about before, the cloud is pay-as-you-go, so take advantage of that. Make sure when you're estimating, if these are workloads that have some variability, that have some capability to be deallocated or shut down when they're not in use, kind of measure out those hours. 530 would mean hours a month would mean that it's off on weekends. 744 is it's up and running 24/7. And then again, make sure along with that you're putting the correct hours, how many instances it is. This will just help you get a better handle on what to expect from the workload that you're looking for. The Azure Pricing Calculator allows you to save and export estimates into Excel. You can save and export as many as you want. So you can change certain assumptions about your workload, about your migration path, about machine sizing, to give you a comparison of what different scenarios would look like moved into Azure. Really important before you look into moving a workload that you either undertake this step yourself or you engage a partner like PCM to help you with this, because without knowing what or predicting what you're going to consume, it is hard to estimate what business value you can get from the scalability, elasticity of the cloud. So once you've anticipated or predicted to the best of your ability what your spend is going to be, you want to talk about, okay, well, where does that spend then fit into my larger Azure environment? How can I make sure that I'm constructing my Azure environment and the services that are deployed inside of it in such a way that I'm isolating services correctly, that I am getting the best reporting, billing granularity that I can out of the constructs that Azure provides. This is really very important as your Azure environment grows to understand what capabilities are available to you to break out different sets of services and spend, so that if you need to do something like chargebacks, or if you just have multiple business units that are looking for some type of reporting on what their services are using and what their costs are, that you've created your Azure environment in such a way that makes it easier rather than harder to get at those metrics. So I will say up front, we're going to talk about all of the different roles and responsibilities that are available from a hierarchy perspective in Azure. This is dependent on how you purchase Azure. Not all roles are available in all agreement types. Specifically, EA and SCE customers that are making upfront commitments to the Azure platform, will have access to higher level roles that will help manage enterprise style spending and business structures. So there are three main portals that you manage Azure through. If anybody on the phone, and I'm sure some of you are using Azure, the one you're most familiar with is the management portal, which is portal.azure.com. That's where the magic happens. That's where services are deployed. They're what's called subscriptions, and they are logically isolated buckets of services. So subscriptions, virtual machines in one subscription cannot talk to virtual machines in another subscription without a VPN tunnel, or there is actually peering now, virtual machine peering to make that happen. But you actually have to do something to do that. They cannot natively look at each other. The second one, especially for pay-as-you-go customers who are currently purchasing on a credit card, is the account portal, which is account.windowsazure.com. This is where you can see multiple subscriptions, where you can get billing and usage reports, where you can submit tickets, things like that. The final is the EA portal, and again, this is for EA and SCE customers, which is ea.azure.com. This is a holistic view of your Azure environment, and it gives you access to, we'll talk about here, some different reporting structures that are designed to help organizations that have large, varied, or complex Azure spend with giving them more reporting and billing granularity and ways to support those Azure and cloud environments than pay-as-you-go with a credit card. So Azure has 4 different roles. The enterprise administrator, which is the EA portal, department administrators, which we'll talk about, account owners, which everyone from credit card all the way up has access to, and then subscription administrators, which can be controlled with role-based access control. So you can get within a subscription where Azure services are deployed, you can get very granular about what users have access to what resources. So here we can see a little bit about how this hierarchy works. So again, when you have an enterprise agreement or an SCE, you have access to that EA portal. It is a billing and reporting portal that allows you to pull reports, set up manage departments, and manage accounts. Underneath the enterprise portal, you can have multiple departments. Departments, again, EA constructions, and they are buckets of accounts. One thing that departments can do that's very valuable for a lot of customers is they can set departmental spending limits. So you can say, this department has $1,200. This department has $15,000. As departments get to that point, as they pass 50%, 75%, 90%, and then head towards 100%, you can set a trail of email addresses that are going to be alerted that they are approaching their spending limit. Important thing to note with departmental spending limits, they are soft, not hard caps. Microsoft does not want to be in the position where they are shutting down mission-critical services because of a spending cap that was placed. So in the event that you exceed a spending limit, your services will continue to work. However, the people that are on that email chain, the people that need to be notified, will get continued notification that that department is over its spending limit. Customers that are working through pay-as-you-go on a credit card, there are also billing alerts that you can set up through the account portal, that account.windowsazure.com, that will help you say, as my account approaches XYZ amount of dollars, I need to be alerted. So this is available from the account level for pay-as-you-go customers. It is available at the department level for EA and SCE customers. So underneath departments, you have accounts. Accounts are buckets of subscriptions. There is one account owner per account. You cannot co-own an account. The account owner's specific privilege is that they can create as many subscriptions as they want under their account. So as you think of it, the account owner permissions, this is if you are the owner of your pay-as-you-go, your credit card subscription with Azure, you are the de facto account owner. So you can create multiple subscriptions under that account, but you do not have access to the higher level enterprise or department permission sets. Underneath accounts, you have subscriptions. This is where, again, the magic happens. Services are actually deployed, and this stuff can all be controlled by role-based access to subscriptions can be controlled with RBAC. So within a subscription, you can get very granular about who has complete control over the subscription, who only has control over specific resources in the subscription. That will help you from a security level make sure that the correct people have access to what they need to do their jobs without having access to other resources that they shouldn't be touching. All of this should be approached from a least privilege perspective. Don't give people accounts when they only need subscriptions. Don't give them departments when they only need accounts. It's important to understand this hierarchy when we're talking about controlling costs in the cloud, because this hierarchy and making sure that this is set up correctly is what's going to inform, okay, well, where does specific spend need to live? Where do specific resources need to live? And how am I going to be able to get easy and accurate reporting about how much this department or this project is going to cost me? And that takes us to reporting. So what reports are available within Azure? What can we as end users pull to make sure that we have accurate information about what our Azure subscription or all of our Azure subscriptions, depending on our access level, are consuming at any given time? So there's a number of places that we can look at our Azure bill based on role and agreement type. If you are currently using pay-as-you-go and you have either invoice privileges, owner privileges, co-administrator privileges or co-owner privileges, or reader privileges on a subscription, you can go into that subscription in the Azure portal, portal.azure.com, and download any prior invoice for your Azure spend along with the usage on that subscription. If you're an account owner, so again, if you're pay-as-you-go, you are de facto the account owner of all of your Azure subscriptions. You can download your usage and your bills on the account portal, so account.windowsazure.com. Now, an invoice, you can download usage available to any account owners, whether they're on EA or pay-as-you-go. And then from the EA portal, so if you have an enterprise agreement and you are an EA administrator, whether you have full rights to the EA or whether you're a read-only, you have access to these reports through the download usage and manage portal or the reports tab in your EA portal, where you can get the same type of reports that you get from an account or subscription. You can also get more advanced reports around, I need this set of 3 subscriptions and I don't need the rest of these, or I need a special time period as opposed to a monthly report. So again, as you move to an EA or server cloud enrollment in SCE, you have some more capabilities when it comes to what type of reporting you can get from Azure. All usage reports, when you download them, are CSV files. They include the hourly cost of all of your services. They include the GUID, for all of your services. They are many, many, many lines of services that you've consumed in Azure if you have any sizable Azure spend on a monthly basis. So when you download those usage reports, the only way to really make sense of them in its raw form is to pivot them. You can pivot them to take out accounts. You can pivot them to take out subscriptions. You can just pivot them to show costs and usage. But you're going to have to do some work with that data to make it valuable when you look at your spend if you're doing it through the CSV files, through the usage reports. Those billing and rate cards, so how much you're spending and how many resources you've consumed, are all reachable through API. They're reachable through that account portal with the billing and reporting. They are reachable through the EA portal that we saw earlier. If you are using Power BI, which is Microsoft's data visualization platform, there is an out-of-the-box dashboard that you can connect to your Azure environment that will give you trends by accounts and subscriptions that you can then, the same way you would with any other Power BI dashboard, you can manipulate them, you can share them out to the rest of your organization. They give you a visualized understanding of where your spend is at and where you're trending. So if you are using Power BI right now and you're using Azure right now and you have not set this up, I would encourage you to take a look at it. It can be very powerful when you are trying to wrap your head around how much your cloud spend is, how much this is costing you and where that cost is coming from. Those APIs are publicly accessible, so if you would like to create your own custom applications or you have your own visualization platforms that you're using, you can reach those billing and rate card APIs and manipulate that data through your own platforms. Pay attention to external charges. So one of the things that I routinely come up with customers is customers that have purchased external products like through the Azure Marketplace, like Barracuda firewalls, load balancers, etc. Very often with solutions like that, the compute costs for something like a virtual appliance are included in Azure and they are billed through Microsoft. However, any licensing schemes or license structures that are separate from the compute are billed outside from the vendor themselves. They're not billed through your subscription. Each external service has a different billing model, so when you set it up, it will tell you whether it's quarterly, whether it's monthly, whether it's something else. The vendor gets to choose that, but just be aware that if you are working in an Azure environment that has lots of external ISV, third-party applications that you've purchased through the Azure Marketplace, that there may be additional invoices and additional charges that do not necessarily translate immediately to that Azure usage report because they're billed outside of what Azure sees. So all of the stuff that we've talked about up till here is ways to understand where the cost is coming from, how the hierarchies work, where spend needs to live in order to make it as useful to you and your organization to get a handle on those costs. And in that vein, we're going to talk about resource tags. So most of the stuff we just talked about is kind of higher level. How are we structuring these subscriptions? How are we structuring these accounts? How are we getting reporting on the hierarchies we've created and the permission levels we've created to make sure that we have an accurate depiction of where those resources are being used, where they live, and who has some ownership of them. When we start getting into the subscription themselves, or itself, I should say, and start trying to understand where a certain VM is costing money or who a certain SQL database belongs to, that's where we need to start using resource tags. So resource tags are a powerful way to organize resources into categories and use those tags along with the report capabilities we just talked about to group and pull out certain types of spend. Tags are at the resource level, so you can tag a resource group, you can tag a specific resource within that resource group, like the virtual machine or the storage account, and consist of a key and a value. So the key could be environment, and then in value could be prod or non-prod. Each resource or resource group can support up to 15 key value pairs, so 15 tags that have a key and a value associated with them. There's a name limit of 512 characters on both of those. One important thing to note is that there's resource groups, and then there are resources under that resource group. So the resource group is the entire thing, and then the resources within it might consist of 2 virtual machines, a storage account, load balancer, for example. When you tag resources, if you tag the resource group, the resources within that resource group do not inherit those tags. You can go in and tag those resources individually, or you can tag the entire group, or you can tag the entire group and then tag those resources as something completely different. There's lots of ways you can do this, but a lot of people say, oh, I'm going to pull out this resource tag and expect all of the underlying resources to also share that tag. That doesn't work. Resource groups don't inherit. The tags on a resource group do not inherit, or resources within a resource group do not inherit the tags of the resource group. Sorry for that weird twisting of phrase. You can apply policies to tags. So you can require untagged or updated resources that don't have a tag to have a key and a value and a default value, for example, so that you can monitor, hey, these are untagged resources or default resources that we need to go back and get some handle on. You can also make sure that there are certain tags and values, like environment, that can't be removed. So even if somebody goes in and tries to untag a resource, that you have policy that says that tag must persist. Tags can be applied to resources through PowerShell or through the Azure portal. You can see here this is at a resource level, so this is a storage account. You can go into the storage account blade in portal.azure.com, click on the tags button, and add different tags to that resource. I just wanted to give you guys some screenshots there. So again, resource tags are a really powerful way to start grouping within a subscription certain kinds of spend and certain, this is dev test and this is production. You can do, as you can see here, things like cost center. So now we can start getting really strategic and granular even within individual subscriptions about how we're breaking out and monitoring spend. Lots of companies like to use resource tags to have some type of declarative department environment type key, and then also something like a user key. So making sure that they know who was responsible for deploying or who was responsible for maintaining certain resources in Azure. That's another big benefit that I see resource tags used a lot for. So now we're going to talk about some of the things that you can do within Azure with the Azure tools to get a handle on your costs and start actually saying, well, what am I doing wrong and how can I reduce my spend based on what I have deployed? And one of the things that was just released into general availability very recently is called Azure Advisor. Azure Advisor is a free personalized cloud consultant. So this is a service within Azure that you can register your subscriptions to right now. Again, it is generally available, and it does not cost you anything to use this service. It offers recommendations in 4 categories. Offers high availability recommendations, so making sure that you have either resources that are deployed in availability groups in case one goes down, or resources that adhere to Microsoft's single VM SLA guidelines to make sure that you have some predictable financially backed up time. It will give you security recommendations. This ties very much into the Azure Security Center. It actually pulls data from that. So Azure Advisor can be a single pane of glass for all of the recommendations in your environment. But if you want to really take advantage of the security recommendations, you would have to also enable Security Center. It will give you performance recommendations on your resources, especially things like app services that can get better performance by being consolidated, Redis cache, etc. And then it will give you cost recommendations as well. So taking a look at what you have deployed in Azure and where you may be able, what is low and underutilized virtual machines, that may be able to be either resized or deallocated based on usage. So this is enabled on a subscription level. So if you have multiple subscriptions, you need to enable it for each of your subscriptions. It's a very simple process and can be viewed by anybody with owner, contributor, or reader privileges in that subscription. To give you some view of the cost recommendations, so it helps optimize and reduce spend by identifying idle and underutilized resources. It does require, from when you turn it on, it requires 14 days to collect data and monitor to identify those systems to make sure that when it tells you something is underutilized, that isn't just a fluke because you turned it on at 3 a.m. That is actually an ongoing issue with this machine, is that you are not utilizing it. It could be resized to potentially save money. And it gives you remediation options within the portal. So it will give you the option to shut down or resize right from the portal, right from the recommendation portal. So again, free to use, very valuable tool, especially if you have right now existing larger Azure environments that you'd like to get some more of a handle on, or if you're just starting out and you want to make sure that you're deploying everything correctly, make sure that you're enabling this right from the get-go so that you can get these recommendations quickly. The IaaS one is kind of the most important. I don't have a screenshot. The cost recommendation engine will also help you determine whether, if you're using Azure SQL Database, which is the platform as a service instance within Azure, that you're getting the value from individual databases, and that it wouldn't make more sense as elastic database pools that can have multiple databases inside them. Another way that we can look at reducing cloud spend in Azure is something called the Azure Hybrid Use Benefit. So this is also fairly new, and this can result, if you guys have investments in existing on-premise OS, so Windows operating system, this can result in some massive savings. The Azure Hybrid Use Benefit allows you to bring your Windows operating system licenses with software assurance, so only if they have active software assurance on them, to Azure, and pay the base compute rate, which is the Linux rate. If you're on the pricing calculator and you're trying to figure out what the base compute rate is, it's the Linux rate. So you're not abstracting that, you're not getting hit with that cost for licensing like you used to. It used to be that you could bring application licenses like SQL or BizTalk into the public cloud, not just Azure, but AWS, with software assurance using a benefit called license mobility. But you were never able to take the operating system. That was always the responsibility of the service provider through their service provider agreement to make sure that those OS licenses were properly accounted for and paid for to Microsoft. Using the Azure Hybrid Use Benefit, which is only available in Azure, as the name would suggest, we can take those OS licenses for the first time with software assurance and bring them into the cloud and get significant savings on your compute rates by abstracting licensing costs. It's different whether you have standard licenses or data center licenses. And again, you have to have active software assurance on all of them. The Azure Hybrid Use Benefit allows 16 core licenses or 2 proc licenses, which is the old model, to run up to 2 virtual machines and up to 16 cores per pair of licensing. With standard licenses, it's an either-or option. So you either have those licenses assigned to Azure and they are not assigned on-premise, and you're using those in your 2 virtual machines or 1 16-core virtual machine in Azure, and you're not using it on-premise, or you're using it on-premise and not in the cloud. With data center licenses, it is actually an additive benefit. So you can continue having your unlimited virtualization host on-premise and also take advantage of 2 VMs and up to 16 cores in Azure. So if you're a customer right now that has Windows Data Center with software assurance licenses and you are in the cloud or looking at the cloud for some workloads, this is a way to find value in that investment that you've made right off the bat. So just the way this works is that you can run 1 or maximum of 2 virtual machines and up to 16 cores. So you can see you either run 1, you run 2. If you have less than 16 cores, you can still only run 2 virtual machines. If you need to run more than 16 cores, so if you want to run like a G5 32-core machine, you can stack licensing by bringing the correct amount of core licenses, whether they are data center or standard, into Azure. The hybrid use benefit is available to any customer, so it doesn't matter whether you have an enterprise agreement, an MPSA, an open agreement, with active software assurance on your license. However, there are some differences between like an enterprise agreement or SCE and pay-as-you-go credit card in terms of what deployment options you have. Basically, with an EA or an SCE, you have access to pre-built gallery images that will enable this hybrid use benefit. If you do not have an EA or an SCE, you have to deploy via PowerShell, via the Resource Manager template, or build your own VM on-premise and send it to the cloud in order to enable this hybrid use benefit. And the final thing I want to talk about here in terms of what you can do to lower your cost is the Azure Compute Pre-Purchase Plan. Azure Compute Pre-Purchase is an offer that provides customers with steady state and predictable workloads the opportunity to get significant discounts by pre-purchasing Azure Compute for 12 months. So guys, this is only available to EA and SCE customers. So if you cannot access these plans, you cannot purchase these plans as the plan exists right now. Microsoft has been saying for a while that they plan on making this widely available, but as it exists right now, it's only available to EA and SCE customers. Basically what it allows you to do is get reserved instances, if you're familiar with that term for something like AWS. So if you know that you're going to be running this size machine in this location for a year, you can get substantial discounts depending on machine size, either Windows or Linux, on IaaS boxes by making a commitment up front to running that machine for 12 months. For EA and SCE customers, it's not coterminous with your enrollment. If you buy it now, it is in effect for 12 months because that's what you've purchased, and it does require upfront payment. You have to choose the instance size, the data center for the machine, and the operating system, Linux or Windows, up front, and you cannot change it midstream. So you have to make sure that we're going to run a D2 instance in East US 2 with Windows for 12 months. That's how you're going to be able to take most advantage of this. The minutes do not roll over. You have 744 hours per month. Once that month is over, you get 744 hours again. You do not get the roll. If you only use it for 530, the additional hours are lost. This is only available for IaaS virtual machines. Past cloud services are not supported. Guys, this is a really, really valuable offer if you have predictable workloads. If you're in Azure right now and you have steady state applications that you plan on keeping there indefinitely, this is a way that you can save a lot of money. However, I would strongly recommend if you are interested in compute pre-purchase that you would contact your account executive at PCM and OnPoint so that we can discuss with you which workloads you have, which workloads are right, and work with you on actually making that purchase and making sure that that transaction happens seamlessly. So in conclusion here, guys, best practices for controlling costs in the cloud: estimate your consumption before you deploy, verify where your services, your deployment is going to live, make sure it is aligned with the correct subscription account department to help you guys get a better handle on your billing. Set up spending quotas and alerts either through the account or through the department to make sure that you're not blasting through some specified amount of spend that you expected. Make sure you're adding tags. Make sure you're instituting a policy where you're tagging resources appropriately every time so that when you need to be able to find out how much production is using, how much non-prod is using, how much user X is using, you have the ability to pull that out. Make sure that all of your subscriptions are enabled with Azure Advisor so that you can get the custom recommendations around cost for your IaaS deployments. And make sure that as you mature your Azure services, you're thinking about the Azure hybrid use benefit and compute pre-purchase and where your steady state predictable workloads can get substantial discounts by making longer term commitments to Azure. We're here to help. If you have questions about Azure or optimizing your costs for the cloud, please reach out to your PCM account executive. They will get us on the call, and we can have a much deeper discussion around where you are, where you want to go, and what we can do to help you manage, monitor, control, and potentially lower your costs in Azure. Thank you very much, guys. I think we've got some time for question here.
Okay, so moving on to the question. The first question I have got is from Gerald Ostrovsky. He's asking, why would I want to go with Azure, and what are the benefits of Azure vs AWS?
Sure. So a lot of this comes down to what workloads you're looking at, what your current stack is in terms of technology, and what your roadmap is. This is not necessarily a part of this presentation, but I'm happy to take the question. If you are looking at enabling a hybrid environment, so you imagine, like most companies are, that you are going to have a sizable on-premise footprint, and then you are going to take the cloud for what the cloud is good for, things like scaling up and scaling down, starting small and growing, predictable or unpredictable bursting. That hybrid connectivity and the way that that's enabled is much through VPNs, through ExpressRoute, just through the ways that Azure treats its environment like a giant Hyper-V environment on steroids, as opposed to its own, as opposed to some different kind of set of VM. Then Azure is going to be the most valuable place for that kind of hybrid environment. Additionally, if you are looking at making the migration not only from on-premise to the cloud, but also from something like infrastructure, so my own personal on-prem cloud, to actually platform as a service where I am ceding more control over the underlying thing to the service provider, but in return I am finding massive benefits in terms of scalability and performance and features and functionality, then I would strongly advise you. Azure has the most comprehensive set of platform as a service offerings out of any public cloud provider. Finally, like some of the things that we talked about here, if you already have, now there's no requirement for this. 1 in every 3 workloads that's running in Azure right now is Linux. But if you are already a Microsoft shop, if you have already made investments in the Microsoft stack, whether that be SQL, whether that be Windows operating system with the Azure hybrid use benefits, you can find some tremendous savings and synergies there with Azure that are not available in other public cloud providers.
Thank you, John. The next question is from John Brickley, and the question is, how is Azure GP paid out, as they may use different amounts monthly?
So when you purchase CPP, you are purchasing a block of 744 hours for a specific instance for a month. So East US to D2 V2 instance with Windows. You got 744 hours. If you use 7 machines for 100 hours apiece, then you're fine. It's covered by that 744. If you use less than that, there are no rollover minutes. So next month you start with a new block of 744 hours. You lose whatever you didn't use on the previous month. If you use over 744 and you deplete that allotment of 744 hours, then you just get charged standard Azure commit rates. So you go back to like a pay-as-you-go model, and you lose the discount for the, if you run it for 800 hours, right, you spend 56 hours that would just be at the standard rate, and then next month you reset. So you can have certain types of flexibility within CPP, but it is really, as it exists at this time, not made for tremendously flexible workloads. It is really, you really find value when you have very predictable, steady state workloads that you know are going to be running for long periods of time in Azure.
Thank you, John. The next question is from Denise. She's asking, how would I find my revenue amount or per unit cost?
So I'm not entirely sure what the question's asking. If you're talking about standard Azure services, obviously, as you know, your partner, PCM, can help you with all of this stuff. If you need cost, if you need cost estimates, if you need to talk about compute pre-purchase or Azure hybrid use benefits, we are here to help. If you are just talking about standard rates for Azure services, the Azure calculator on azure.com is going to give you accurate rates for Azure pay-as-you-go services all the time.
Thank you so much, John. These are all the questions I have in the questions box. So with that, thank you so much, John, for taking the time out and giving us a great presentation and getting the questions out. And also for all of you joining us today, please be sure to check out our website, www.onpoint.com/webinars or pcm.com/webinars for any upcoming events. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you again for future webinars. Have a great day.